Let me recap at the beginning. This should have been the most perfect studio to make this, but was made in the most unperfect way. I still believe in good movie-to games. Okay, 2020 is over, so here's my op on the Blair Witch game. Be warned, there's going to be some spoilers. It's funny to think that this isn't the first time developers have tried to take a stab out of this mythos, as it was done 3 other times back in the early 2000s. This Forgotten Trilogy reminds us that the franchise is large and old enough to be amongst other iconic horror games, so to take it out of its long hiatus, despite it being not connected to those entries, with Bloober cashing in on the first-person horror trend. So we get the simply titled Blair Witch game. And yes, we get to see the first-person perspective of a doomed hike through the haunted woods of Maryland, along with everything that's trying to spook you up. Yeah, they did a really good job of recapturing the first film's visuals, even though it's not behind the lens of a camera. But when they screw it up is when you start to think you're playing a Silent Hill game. You see, the reason why those games worked is because it was a bunch of particular people descending into the realms of the dead, carrying emotional and traumatic baggage that will take the form of some scary monster or obstacle. And while yes, that was inspired by other movies that came before it, but it completely lacks that whole less clear equals more tension scares the way old Ellie played with her victims. The thing about the original students that they were a blank slate. It was that feeling of, hey, what would I do in that situation? It could work with anyone, to the point where I feel that even if you put Mario as the protagonist, it would get the same result. Yeah, really. This becomes more of a problem when you realize there's nothing subtle going on here. A lot of the stuff is very in your face with sometimes another face. There's nothing in Ellis's journey that can be hinted or cryptically applied about who he was and where he came from. And I know we're in the protagonist's head instead of looking through a video camera, but it still feels like you're playing one of the lost Silent Hill characters, along with the style of voice acting. There's also a combat system. While I'm glad that they didn't give us any type of weapons to use or anything, it's nice to see personally that Resident Evil 7 didn't change things that much. Well, apart from your flashlight, the option of running still should have been the best way to live a unhappy rest of your life. Even though it is a minor thing, because, well, there's very few enemies, or whatever they're called. It brings me on to another problem that it feels way too similar to the remake. Oh, I'm sorry, I mean sequel. I know it's trying to be an original story, but there's so much of the Blair Witch lore they could dip in and work with in some creative way. So what we got here is kind of a boring story. The visuals really are good. It's from the same people who brought you Layers of Fear, and their take on the Burkittsville wilderness, along with the sound, is really good. They captured a lot of atmosphere from that place, cramming so much atmosphere down your throat. You do really feel isolated, even though they're trying to spice things up with the kind of locations you find yourself in, like the woods will almost become different colors. Again, it's just the overuse of style. They do a pretty good job of breaking up the monotony with the kind of things you'd expect to find deep in the woods, such as huts, sawmill, and steam donkeys, and trenches and bunkers that they don't actually explain. Well, it's nice to see some ambiguity. It's just really hard to keep track on what's going on, because the story's just so uninteresting. The sound design really works for the most part. You have that eerie silence of nature, and it's got that unnerving ambience that you don't know if it's the sounds you had no idea existed in a dark, isolated sector of woods, or just unknown, unrecognizable force of evil. It's nowhere as forgettable as the main soundtrack. Well, in comparison. But I wish that kind of effort was put into whatever you're meant to be fighting. These so-called monsters are kind of hit and miss. They would look better some other place, like maybe someone's front yard Halloween display. And then there's those weird leafworm things that were probably just put there for an excuse to have you ride a cart to your destination. And then there's those Yuleman things that it would have been better if you didn't have them pop up on your camera. They really could have built up the anticipation more if they kept them in the darkness, even though their placements, in my opinion when I played it, are badly designed. Okay, let's obsess over Bullet for a short period of time. Your loyal canine companion who's gonna help you find little Timmy MacGuffin. And yes, he looks realistic, upstaging a lot of other things here. It does create more of a tension to survive for the sake of your dog. you can get a lot more attached to him than the so-called backstory that feels so needed. Of course, you get the references and little nods to the original 1999 classic. When I first saw one of those hanging scarecrow things, it did trigger something in me, even though it didn't last long. But those phallic wood carvings that you come across now and again kind of make me scratch my head in a way, because, while yes, it's just a part of the whole collectible thing, why does he make a big deal when he finds the first one? That weird or important to keep with you, and judging how it was near the rest of the cars at the beginning, you'd come to the conclusion that it probably belongs to one of those people. But no, it has to feel pretty forced. And then there's those pesky multiple endings that don't depend on moral decisions or going above and beyond with your actions. It's strange that after the endurance of not putting man's best friend down, making you go through that torturously long walk through the canyon, that it would possibly melt the witch's heart to give you the best ending possible. But no, you have to do other questionable things, like not fight off those tree monsters. That should be a good thing, because it's advising players not to confront the terror, leaving the monster more of a psychological threat. But they give you a text tutorial making you think that's the only way you're going to get through that part. And how do you achieve one of those endings? Well, you gotta go through the whole shtick again, Rustin Parr's house. And while it does look as good as the woods you trek through, it goes on way too long. Along with that whole don't look at her thing that was originally the whole ritualistic killing of the children of Rustin Parr, there's also the so-called minion, Carver. While I do like the design of him, the performance is still very predictable. While he could have been kind of similar to Parr, you know, that whole, where am I, what am I doing, I was made to do this, it's more kind of Charlie Manson with the whole, I'm a disciple of her type thing. You know, it would have been actually cool to end it in the so-called cemetery that's in the woods. You know, the one Heather and her boys were trying to find in the film. Whatever. Well, at least the Mystery Inc. gang were able to find it in the Scooby-Doo project. So that's mostly everything that is circulating in my brain about this. It might differ from yours, but at least we can agree on one thing. Bullet is still a good boy.